Okay, fantastic. Welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble, and I'm here with Dr. Dale Simpson Jr., who is an expert on the archaeology of Rapa Nui, and in particular the stones. He's a geoarchaeologist, so he takes a very geoarchaeological approach. So yeah, it's great to have you here, Dale. I mean, you've been going to Rapa Nui, Easter Island for how long?
After this year, it'll be about 25 years
Wow.
visiting and participating in the island and island culture. The first time I was there was in 2001. I went with a field school, your junior year of undergrad. They try to kick you out and do some real work. So I'm pretty,
Mm-hmm.
this was the time there wasn't a million posts on social media or dig ventures. They would, in our big bulletin board in the room, they would just have posters on the wall to different field schools that somehow got sent to professors. And I remember I was looking on the wall. We had just studied a little bit about Jared Diamond and this idea of collapse and ecocide. And sure enough, the University of Hawaii at Manoa was giving a field school under Dr. Terry Hunt, who's the foremost expert, one of them, of Rapa Nui archaeology at the moment.
Okay, yeah, I think I saw one of his lectures on from National Geographic on YouTube while thinking about this.
He's the leader in the field. He also marked my thesis, so I think that's great. And I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to talk about the island.
Hmm.
It's a real chance to try to give a little power to truth for the Rapa Nui people. There's a lot of, I think, misinformation and straight up lies about the island that gets told.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
more fortunate to work with you in this because, as I had mentioned, your dad was one of my instructors while I was learning about Easter Island archaeology. So in a
Ah.
way, I've been working with now the Dibbles, the Dr. Dibbles for two generations. He came to the University of Auckland and was working with Dr. Simon Holdaway, who's
Hmm.
another lithic specialist working with Neanderthal work because he had studied in France as well. And I remember his very, you know, uh, the importance of technology in archaeology. That really tweaked myself because I knew if I wanted to go to Rapa Nui and do work, I wanted to do something that no one else had worked on.
Yeah.
And that really strived for me to say, okay, everyone's looked at Moai, the statues, everyone's looked at Ahu, the platforms, but people haven't looked at the basalt. And that was one thing that I really started to focus my energy on, and then learn about the geology and the connection between archaeology and geology. So it
Hmm.
was I would say that your dad had a little bit to do with a little of my career going forward. So I'm just happy to be able to talk to you as well. Second generation dibs.
Thank you, Dale. I'm honored. No, seriously, and I think that your approach to the stones and basalt and other stones and taking that geological approach and sort of more empirical approach is really important. So we're
Yep.
talking, of course, about Rapa Nui, and everybody, of course, is familiar with these Moai. Some people claim are enigmatic and mysterious, and we're going to show that they're maybe a little less so than people think. Here's where it is. It's way off to the east of Polynesia. So you imagine people traveling all the way through these island chains. And then, of course, there's the issue of the name. People are more familiar with the name Easter Island. Where does the name Rapa Nui actually come from?
Yeah, that's a good one. So if you go back to another map,
Yeah.
you'll notice that there's a place called Austral Archipelago
Aha, right
right
here.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in one of those islands, there's an island called Rapa Iti.
Mm-hmm.
And some have argued that when the slave industry was coming in there, people wanted to differentiate sort of the names that they weren't from Rapa Iti, they were from the bigger Rapa
Okay.
Nui.
Okay.
But Rapa is also a ceremonial paddle on the island that were used sort of by probably lesser chiefs. There is some issue with the name. Really, the islanders call it themselves Te Pinto Te Henua, which really means the belly button of the world, the navel of the world. And it's quite an interesting thing because that's the most sacred part where your mana from your ancestors get moved to you.
Yeah.
So being in the heart of the world there, the
And
navel of the world.
a lot of these statues, of course, also have their belly buttons nicely represented.
Absolutely, absolutely, and usually between the hands, and some have argued that you'll notice the fingers are quite large.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's been interpretations as to why, but really it's because they have long fingernails, because that's where
Okay.
your mana grows from. You don't cut your fingernails, you don't cut your hair, because that's where the mana, your energy, your life force comes from. So that was one thing that sort of dominated a little bit of that aesthetic of the Moai, which is a great one there. So here you could see that beautiful belly button. You see the long fingernails, and then between you have what's called the hami, or the loincloth. And as you turn around to the back, what you have there with those three lines, that's the motto. That's the sacred back part of the loincloth. And those figures are representing things that have been seen as birds, lightnings, the sun. So there are some interpretations, but that's probably what that Moai looked like originally. And then as the Moai cult and the Moai lifestyle loses its sort of phase and power, then the Birdman cult comes in. So why this piece is so important, besides it being basalt, besides it being one of the first ones to be taken off the island, is that it shows that transition of the Birdman cult. So that image is great. And you could just see how much being buried helps the preservation of those statues
Oh,
compared
for
to the
sure.
line above. So when people ask, why don't we excavate them all out? Well, could you imagine if the entire statue looked like from the, underneath the lip up? We'd lose a lot of that information. So that's why a lot of them till today are still buried, because it's the best preservation we can have for them.
Yeah, you can see the huge difference between that stark contrast. To me, it's sort of like it's quite obvious that these Moai, they actually fit in very well with Polynesian material culture, right? There's a lot of links between Easter Island and the larger Polynesian cultures. Do you want to
Absolutely.
go into some
Yeah.
detail on that?
Um, I'm much more of someone about, independent innovation. Yes, the Rapa Nui people had their Polynesian, we call them Maohi, is sort of the term that's gets used to put the, Polynesian, Micronesia, Melanesia. That's a term made by a lot of old white dudes who wanted to simplify the diversity we have in the Pacific. We
Hmm.
know we have a variety of languages. I like to make the analogy that some of the earliest groups we see in the Pacific are like 65,000 years old in
Hmm.
Australia, Papua New Guinea, and then we move on through with Lapita. You can imagine it's like a tree, So the tree analogy is one of my favorite things that I have. You've got these older groups, and then the bark, the main trunk is Lapita, and then as you go through, you have all the branches, and the
Hmm.
branches are really Polynesians. And although they have similar leaves, every branch is different. It depends on their latitude. It depends on how far they're into the southern waters. Do they have a lot of environmental influences from something like we're dealing with now, La Nina y El Nino? So a lot of folks have said Polynesia was like this laboratory of life, and each island had its own variables. But what we see in Rapa Nui is a continuation of all these variables until almost a climax.
We know the diffusion of people to this area of the Pacific only started what, 2,000 years ago, something like that,
Yeah,
1,500?
yeah, I would say that. Yeah, into Polynesia proper, probably 2000. I think some of the earlier dates that we're seeing, what we have in before they become Polynesia, they're sort of in Tonga and Samoa, which we
Hmm.
consider more West Polynesia. They're there during the Lapita time, which
Okay.
is that sort of second culture. We can probably pull that back to 2, 3,000 years ago. That they're really formed, but from there, I call that's the Polynesian milkshake. And from there, they get all mixed together with all of the different techniques and monumental architecture and fish hooks. And from there, they make the first push out and probably become Polynesia in the water, not on land. I think that's a
Hmm.
very important thing, that one of the uniqueness about the Polynesians in general was just how much water and area they covered in less than 2,000 years. I mean,
Yeah.
they covered something like the fifth of the globe, and we're quite confident they make it all the way to South America. But we've got to remember, navigation is not just going one way. They also went back.
Yeah.
That's an important bit. Everyone's got this idea that diffusion always goes forward. It's a circle that pulps out, and then it no, these Polynesians went back to ancestral lands. They went
Hmm.
back to areas that Lapita had already lived in. So it's very interesting to see their movement. They were going eastwards and westwards, depending on their abilities and the time of year and the winds and so forth. Just to hammer this point, what I think is interesting about Rapa Nui and the statue industry is that it just reached a high end that it didn't reach on other islands.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's the pinnacle right there, to show that they were probably pretty isolated for about 500 years. We don't see that much migration to Rapa Nui after it happens.
That's
And it seems,
something I was going to ask. So you mentioned they
yeah,
go back. I mean, it's so far away from the rest of these Pacific islands. Is there still sort of connection after it's settled?
that is the working question. So my advisor at the University of Queensland, he's the Jedi Master in geochemical research. He did his PhD about the interaction sphere of Mangareva, Pitcairn, and Henderson.
Mm-hmm.
So he showed by using geochemical analysis, basically every volcano, every stone could be seen as a finger, and then any artifact you pull from that finger is going to have that fingerprint.
Mm-hmm.
It's chemically discrete enough that you can identify different quarries. So what
Interesting.
he showed is that these groups are taking stone from some area, they're moving it to other areas because not all the islands had what they needed in the individual islands. So one
Gotcha.
island was really strong to have horticultural crops and pearl shell, but another had fine grained basalt. Another had turtles and environmental resources. So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically, for 500 years there's this interaction sphere of people living in really isolated areas, but the interaction keeps them together.
Yeah.
It's probably this pulse that gets them to Rapa Nui. They needed to interact to get to Easter Island.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they get to Rapa Nui, we look at some of the DNA evidence actually of commensal models of rats,
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
which is quite interesting. And what the rat data is showing is that there was not that much introductions beyond one main rat population.
Interesting.
Polynesians brought rats with them on purpose.
Okay.
We think of them as stowaways, but Polynesians would use them because they're good meat for fishing. You've got tails, you've got bones, you've got a variety of things you could use. They breed very quickly, so if you were really hungry, right? So these rats, I call them the splinter, like Teenage Mutant. He's the splinter rat. So he comes in, and this rat is basically the dominant species that moves throughout the island, and actually has a little bit to do with why the island's palms don't regenerate, because these rats love to eat that those nuts. There they are.
Yeah.
So on the top there, you that's in Chile actually. That's the Jubaeus palm tree. That is what we think the palm tree would look like. That has very fat root system. Palms aren't trees; they're grass. In all
Huh.
reality, they're not a tree species. So what we see is we see a variety of things. Like we see the root molds that we can still see in the stratified deposits.
Is that
So
what's
we
being
know
held here?
absolutely. So that's a
Okay.
beautiful little root mold. And then when we've excavated some of the caves, we find those endocarps, which are those seed bearing inside bits of the palm that would come out. But if you notice on all of those, they're all eaten. And that's
Yeah.
because the ratones, the kioe and Rapa Nui, as they say, is loving that thing like a filet mignon. And it's
Did
ripping
are
into
the rats now extinct because they consume so much of this, or are they still pervasive there?
it was like a world of fighting splinters, and the Polynesian rat was actually taken over by the European rat. So
Aha,
after
interesting.
Europeans come, that rat gets on land and it's much larger than Rattus exoliths, and the European rat is just so much more dominant and aggressive. But it's the meeting of those two. One of the biggest things is they start eating all of the eggs and bird species.
Huh.
And we know the importance of birds as pollinizers, and to pollinate and to move ecosystems through. We slowly see this decrease in biodiversity. And on top of it, you probably have environmental activities and or events, both global and local, that are happening to the island. And it's really in a perfect storm, for to see just huge degradation.
And this is one of the things that chatting with you and prepping for this and thinking about it that really amazed me is just how well understood and studied Rapa Nui is by scholars, not just the archaeology, but like one of your slide decks that you shared with me included, for example, the spiders that were introduced. And so it's this little, partly because it's so isolated and so distinct, that it's been intensively studied by people who are interested in climate, in geology, in archaeology, in biology, in all these different sort of things. It's sort of amazing that someone like Thor Heyerdahl or Jared Diamond or Graham Hancock or Ancient Aliens, History Channel's Ancient Aliens, is going to go there and try to create this air of, wow, we really don't understand this stuff. When in fact, I mean, I work in places like Athens and Knossos, two of the most studied sites in the Greek world. This is easily equivalent. All the sites
Oh
that
yeah,
have even been found, like it's not an enormous island. What is it, like 7, 8 kilometers across? Am I reading that right? That scale right?
yeah. So basically, it's miles. It's the same
Oh,
size as
miles.
Washington D.C.
Okay.
That one. So in miles, just for the audience, it's 15 by 16 by about 22. So
Miles.
it's
Okay.
yeah.
15 by
So
6.
it's a little bit larger. This is from Mulrooney's work, Mara Mulrooney, a colleague of mine. This is just radiocarbon dating that we know.
Huh.
these are
This is
these are
just
this is not sites. These are just radiocarbon dates that we have in stratified deposits that have gone through the majority through radiometric hygiene. So they've gone through the principles of finding the best dates that we have, eliminating water, marine samples, and really trying to focus on short-lived burnt species that the island would have had through grasses and trees and bushes and whatnot. This is just carbon 14.
And so
That's
this is must total equal. I mean, because there's probably more than one at each of these points. So
sure.
this must total equal hundreds of radiocarbon dates from different clear stratified contexts associated with what, platforms and statues and
Yep.
all this excavation in situ. It's being
And
pulled out
and let's
and
and let's add, because we also use on Rapa Nui obsidian hydration.
uh-huh.
It's a great place to use obsidian hydration, although it has some methodological limits because you really have to calculate ground humidity, and there's a lot of that goes behind it. But we have another, we'll say, hundreds of dates from obsidian hydration.
Okay.
So I always say a solo date is a worried date, but when we start adding all of these dates together, let alone solid archaeology of things like superposition, right? And basic archaeological principles that I would add, the majority of these pseudo archaeologists never use, or these reporters.
Yeah.
They don't depend on just simple basic facts about the higher it is, the younger it is, the lower it is, and they look, instead of the entire sequence, they pigeonhole one thing that may be
Yeah.
an aberration, that may be a rebuild or a dig out, or the thousand things archaeologists try to consider when they look at a profile or when they look at a deposit. They quickly dismiss those things because they're too complex to describe, and how could it come to be? And you're like, well, honestly, it's quite easy if you just use a simple principle, right?
Yeah, and I mean it's combined between this and then the kind of environmental studies that we really put this
Boom.
together.
Yep.
And this is not based off of just cherry picking one date out of here or just
Nope.
drilling a core down and saying the oldest date relates to the archaeology that's on the surface, like I discussed in a recent interview about Gunung Padang in Indonesia. And yeah, I mean this is based on a whole lot of work and evidence that comes together, and it's not something that you can really just dive into from a few, even just reading a few things. It's a lifetime study, as you
Yeah.
kind of mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And I think I would also put in there that Rapa Nui has the most publications written about it than any Polynesian island.
Huh.
I just say that again. It has more in all the fields, not just archaeological. So why I'm ranting about this is that there was this thing written many years ago by Paul Bond and Fenley, John
Mm-hmm.
Fenley, who passed. It was 1992. It was called, and 93, and then they republished it in the 2000. It was called Easter Island, Earth Island. And it was the idea that Easter Island was this microcosm for everything that was going to happen in the world. So the Rapa Nui people over consumed their resources, chopped down the trees. The world's going to do that. Rapa Nui went into a civil war. The world is going to do that. Rapa Nui's culture became extinct and collapsed. The world is going to do that. And it was like this cautionary tale about what was going to happen to the world. All of a sudden, people that actually work there empirically and do the work and put their lives there, everyone hit the brakes. They're like, whoa, 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 slow down. This is a great narrative. And you obviously have your chair and your stool made, and you have your supports. Let's see how strong your supports are of the stool. And we started to tease out and identify these tenets of collapse of Easter Island, Earth Island. And after so many years, they don't hold weight.
Yeah.
And then that book was further solidified by a movie called Rapa Nui, made by Kevin Costner, which completely changed the island culture. And it visually showed the Rapa Nui people cutting down the last tree. Right? It visualizes this idea of collapse. Then Diamond jumps on it. He writes a paper called Easter's End, which becomes one of his chapters in Collapse. And then all of a sudden, Rapa Nui is seen as this horrible place to live. But what we're seeing is that if I want the world to be a microcosm, I want it to be Rapa Nui, because they survived, man. They're still
Yeah.
alive today. They survived COVID. They're back and celebrating their ancestral arts. They have multiple kids going to colleges around the world. They have their own cleanup and recycling programs on the island. So if we really want to reevaluate what Rapa Nui is, it's not collapse, it's survival. And I that's one point I just wanted to hit with you really hard. So I can foresee trying to sell this collapse idea. Any evidence you have for collapse, it was based in something in the 1990s and 2000s.
Of
It doesn't
course.
represent anything that we've done since 2000 moving forward. The civilized culture collapsed, so did the Rapa Nui people. And that's not true. They're still living today. There's 9,000 of them on the island, and the
Huh.
culture's stronger than ever. And if we want to identify a quote unquote collapse, it's after European contact.
I guess two of the things that are cited in this myth of collapse is the loss of writing and then the knocking down of statues is sort
Yes,
of the two
yes,
main things. And
yep.
so is there a way to sort of date these phenomena so that they're securely seen as after 1722?
A publication just came out 2 weeks ago. I
Okay.
mean, I don't know if you got to see that one where they dated some Rongo Rongo, which is
Okay.
that name, Kahau Rongo Rongo. There's about 28 known tablets in the world. And sadly, not one original is located on Easter Island, on Rapa
Oh,
Nui.
that's not good.
They're all located in museums as people came in. But one thing the missionaries, they do their work well, is they made the islanders burn many of these tablets because they were representing different idols, and the whole story that I'm not going to spend time in because it's old hat. But
Yeah.
two dates on one of the tablet suggest it was made before European contact.
Okay.
So we could argue that Rapa Nui had a writing system. However, it's mostly for the elite,
Yeah.
and the elite are using that to maintain power and sacred genealogies and origin stories that only that upper echelons of society would be able to read and write. My favorite there, the bottom, I guess in the middle bottom, the fish, that's actually at the Field Museum, and it's a replica. It's actually a fake where the Rapa Nui people had created that to sell at some of the markets, but they did a really good job to beat up the wood and use an older type of wood. So it's interesting how Rapa Nui materials as well is located all throughout the world.
Let's move a little bit towards your research a little bit. By way of introduction, I want us to think kind of, these Moai, so much of the public discourse about it is focused on a lot of early research, right? Is focused on how do you move this? How do you lift it? It's just there's so many different images and ways that people have come up with to, and then of course the reconstructions today, you can see that they're liftable even with modern machinery. But that's just one picture of it. But why is that what everybody focuses on? Every single YouTube video on Easter Island. Come on, what we there's so many different ways that people could have moved this. There's so much more interesting questions we can ask, don't you think?
I mean, you sound like me. Maybe we switch roles and you could just do that. When I was doing my PhD, a hotel on the island hired me to guide. And that really helped me because I was able to meet a variety of people, usually very intelligent. I would say the most common question I receive, besides talking about collapse, talking about do people still live on Easter Island, the third most common question is how do they move the statues? And my answer was, after a while, in a joking fashion, I don't care. And they would be like, but how can you say that? This is what we're here for. And I'm like, listen, here's the easy bit. They move them.
Yeah.
All right. Let's make that parallel. Let's just establish that premise. They
And I
move
mean,
them.
I think that this obsession it smacks of colonialism itself. I mean, it's sort of like it's like saying, how can we believe these Stone Age people could move these huge stones? And I mean, that's exactly what draws in pseudo archaeologists. That's why
Boom.
anytime there's megaliths, really big stones, it's aliens or Atlantis or
Right.
whatever. And it's sort of like, moving really big stones, cultures all over the world in different periods have figured this out. It's not rocket science. I mean, it's moving really large stones. It's principles of physics and geometry and stuff like that, and so, yeah, I mean, they're totally capable of moving these stones. It's not so surprising. I mean, could I do it? No, but I've seen, people I work with on archaeological sites move heavy stones. And I've been part of a team, moving a heavy stone. You get enough people, get enough ropes. You have a know-how of people that have done it before, and you can do it.
You're spot on. It reminds me though of something a little darker, and just straight racism
Hmm.
and ethnocentrism.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of the meme where it's the Family Guy, and they've got a skin tone on there, and
Yes.
if it's light brown or dark brown, it's aliens.
Hmm.
If it's above and it's white people can move that stuff. They negate the ability of people like Polynesians and South and Pacific Islanders that they couldn't do that because they weren't white.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Exactly.
scary. And
Yeah.
on Rapa Nui, I know I've seen Rapa Nui people do the same task 10 different ways. So when people ask me how do they move the statues, I say it wasn't one way. There's a multiplicity of ways.
Yeah.
Because we've got to take in context, Rapa Nui is undulating. It's a volcanic island with uneven flows. And although they did make a Moai road, mostly where they're leaving the quarry to help, once you get to the western and northern coast, that is very rugged land.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
you are not going to walk a Moai going uphill.
Yeah.
So the reason why is that my point is the Rapa Nui people had multiple ways, and perhaps each clan, when it came to a certain area that they had to pivot and move that Moai over, they used a certain technique that the rest of the island didn't use
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
it was that specific, ramp or angle or downward bit that they had to create wooden structures or ramps or types of pulley systems that would help them move that through. But if we go back to what the Rapa Nui people say, is
Yeah.
that Mana moved the Moai. The
Okay.
chief's energy moved the Moai. And it's not through telekinesis, it's not through magic, it's through his ability to organize the economic, ideological, and socio-political components of life. These guys are project managers in today's day and age. And they look to find all of the pieces. They've got to feed their workers. I think one of the hardest things to move the statues is twofold. One, spirituality. There's a spiritual component about making one of your dead ancestors walk back to his home platform.
Hmm.
And then the socio-political connections because you're passing through another clan's land.
Yeah.
Those are the more difficult questions than the physicality of how do you move statues. Dude, they move them. We don't have a problem to think about anywhere in the classic world these individuals moving large marble columns and statues. But when it comes to other cultures of the world, especially in the Pacific, there's no way they can do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they could. So, in short, the functionality of moving a statue is not that hard. We've even done Terry Hunt, who I talked about earlier, and Carl Lippo. They already made the Moai walk.
Yeah,
The,
yeah,
the refrigerator method. But if you notice, that's on a flat plane.
yeah,
Once you got to these
yeah.
other areas, right, you would need other techniques, and that's what they did. They used this multiplicity of movement, and
I think
that's
that
how
makes a
they
lot of
moved the
sense. And
statues.
I think it shows just how smart they are. And I mean, it really shows why we need to trust the kind of oral histories that we get. I mean, you sort of look and the dates support their stories of foundation. The way that the land has been divided supports their stories of how the land was divided into different areas. And that's
Sure.
backed up by the location of the Moai, which sort of helped divide the landscape politically. I think that that's really key to see, to really trust this. And you've already started hinting at, all right, what can we do in terms of empirical geological questions rather than this sort of let's do some experiments and whatnot, if you see what I mean, right?
Yes,
And
sir.
so I think it's amazing that it's three volcanoes together, right, that form
Yeah.
this island, which gives this diversity. And I mean, to me, you were talking about how different Polynesian islands had one resource or another and they had to trade. Here, you have such a diversity within this sort of landscape that you have that volcanic sort of tuff, I guess it is, that the
Yep.
Moai is made from. So we have the quarries and we have the distribution and we have a sense of that, but we can also do that with the little hats. Is that what they
Yep.
are? They're hats that are on top of the head. They're
There's a few. The pukao are a few interpretation.
okay.
Dyed red. Some would argue that this is the original man bun.
Okay.
This is a top knot that would be dyed red as well. That they would have. Others
Interesting.
may others may see it as a hat or a headdress,
Uh-huh.
usually
Uh-huh.
a feathered headdress. But the oral tradition is quite interesting. The oral tradition argues that the moai are actually the human male reproductive organ, and the red pukao is the female reproductive organ.
Uh-huh.
And
Interesting.
so, why we look for it just representing the deified ancestors of the past, it may be representing things like fertility. And we
Mm-hmm.
know that is a cultural universal because we understand the importance of fertility for not just humans, but plants and animals and the planet that we live on. So the Rapa Nui people, in a way, are also talking about fertility and who's in charge of making sure the mana is put through the fertility, the chiefs and the elite. And that's
Okay.
why they're represented in these megalithic features.
And they're made of this very really striking red stone, which
Yeah, scoria.
yeah, scoria, which has also been explored intensively in a sense.
Yep.
Is this some part of your project and research as well, or
No, I one thing that this is actually done by people in the UK.
okay,
There's a whole group of British investigators that have looked more, of course, as they would. They're very phenomenological in their approach and understanding the noises and movement and visual scapes. But they have done a lot of, I think, fine grain archaeology. Yeah, that's great. So we can see that a lot of places had this material to use.
mm-hmm.
But what's interesting, they mostly chose one specific area for the top nuts. The same with the Moai. 95% come from one area.
Yeah,
Obsidian, there's four sources on the island, but the majority of the tools of lithics come from Orito. And my research for my PhD showed that the majority of basalt used on the island comes from one place.
okay,
Why? Because they were geological masters. They knew for whatever they were going to make what was going to be the best stone of choice.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They also would create microeconomies around those particular sources. And now, if you look at a territorial map, one clan doesn't have all the resources that it needs to make that complex. Only one clan has all the Moai stone. Only one clan has the Pukao stone and the foundation stone. So what you're really seeing is that there's a communal use of this stone. And as I've said in we did a feature film for a company in France. I didn't even know I could speak French, but they dubbed it. It was great. My French voice is hilarious. But what I try to argue there is that it was the stone on Rapa Nui that brought them together.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Because if you wanted to build something, you couldn't just depend on your clan land. Sure, there was some opportunistic use that you had access to that stone and you used it. But if you wanted to get a beautiful red pukao, you know you had to trade, exchange, work with that other group to bring in that material. That's the real jux of my argument against collapse, that everyone was competing and they were fighting and it was civil war. No, to build some 25,000 archaeological features we have on Rapa Nui, my argument is there was a lot of collaboration. There
Mm-hmm.
was a lot of groups working together and pooling certain resources, certain microeconomies to be able to go and pool and work with other groups. And not to forget, you also have to walk and pass through other clan lands. That
Mm-hmm.
included offerings and discussion and debate and marriage partner exchange and bringing resources in. That's why I think the hardest thing about Rapa Nui was the socio-political movement of statues, not the physical movement of statues.
Yeah.
They had that down. That's a piece of cake, man. They were already coming from islands that they already were doing that on. What makes it hard is I got to pass through 7 clans to bring my statue from the quarry. So I got to make sure I've got enough sweet potato, taro, fish. The point is, it was socially harder to transport statues than physically. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the real lesson of Rapa Nui. Obviously, they had conflict, but they had conflict resolution. So if Rapa Nui is really a microcosm for the world, I wanted to know that it's a place of conflict resolution. And that's something that I've really learned in my almost 25 years of working there.
All right, so I have a few questions for you about your own research on the basalt.
Sure.
Because I think it's a really key thing. So, like with this plan, I'm
Yeah.
guessing most of the basalt is from these larger rectangles,
Yes, sir.
and then
Yes,
it's
sir.
going out to the west and elsewhere. So this is one of the basalt quarries that you
Yeah.
documented. Where
Yeah.
is this located? This is from this big square or
Yeah, right
somewhere
there.
else?
You know what? If you can actually see it from space. If
Okay.
you go put your right in the middle, you put it right in the middle of the box, the bigger one, the Putoki Toki, right a little bit right there.
Aha, I
That
see it.
is
Yeah.
that is actually so big that it took me probably, a good 10 days to just work one quarry, because there's so much going on here. And this is great evidence of them being geologists.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew, if you see the thing in the middle called puku, those are basically outcrops.
Uh-huh.
And because Rapa Nui is created like a birthday cake with multiple volcanic layers, each volcanic layer is dependent on how deep the magma chamber cut into different areas. What was the temperature? Did it rain the day the eruption happened? Was it cooled quickly? There's so many little variables that make differences. But what's really cool at the Puku, they would identify those and basically excavate them by their layers.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
each layer that they would go through the cake, they would use that in different parts of the island and their constructions.
Okay.
So on the top layer, it's vesicular basalt. With
Okay.
basalt, if basalt's moving very quickly and the lava's flowing and the gas is moving out, it creates a lot of holes. That's all the gas leaving out, and therefore you have all the little holes, and it's not fine grain. It's coarse grain.
Okay.
But what does the sound if lava makes if it goes really slow and there's nothing, right? That gets rid of all impurities, all gas, and it's very solid. And that is perfect for stone tool making.
Okay.
So on the top, they have everything they need to make things like foundation stones and ahu walls. But this other material called Hawaiianite is perfect for stone tool making. And that's what they want on the mid to bottom line of those puku. And they remove them as boulders. Then you'll start to see these reduction zones because they're pulling out these boulders and then they're either throwing them into the poo or the pit, so they start to break in cobbles that they can reduce. So if you look at that poo on the top there, you'll notice that's sort of a staging area. And then in that middle workshop area, the larger poo, they're slamming those big boulders together to start to get at smaller manageable chunks. Then they
Okay.
sort of move to the margins and they slowly start to reduce that stone. And we start to see tons of debitage, or the byproduct of the reduction sequence. And then they start to make blanks and preforms, which we also find there. But besides the hammerstone, we rarely find complete artifacts on site.
Okay.
So perhaps they're taking that material back to their final resting place, and there they're doing the final touches,
That makes
right?
sense. A lot of areas of the world that happens. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's another universal to show that, there's only certain ways you can work with stone, man. Like there's a known sequence because that's what you do when you work with stone.
Yeah, you break it
Uh,
down and yeah.
how you break it down. So they have the debitage, and what they start using, if you notice, there's the ferns that are growing. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times then they recycle and reuse the debitage to make stone mulch gardens.
Yes, I have this image here. Yeah.
So this is crucial. Rapa Nui has unpredictable rainfall. It's not a tropical island. People think of Rapa Nui and tropics. No.
Let's move back towards maybe some other aspects of elite Polynesians, these stones. So
Yeah.
these are their houses, and this is also built out of that upper layer of basalt, is what you're saying?
Bam, exactly. So
Okay.
that's the vesicular basalt. These stones in general, they're called paenga stones, which
Mm-hmm.
represent family. And they're very large basaltic stones that would support the superstructure of a variety of branches and posts directly into the stone.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of questions about how they drill those stones. Well, there's very harder rocks than this basalt. So they already knew what the hardness scale was. So you can make a bow and arrow drill with a very large Hawaiianite drill head, and that would help you to slowly work your way. There are two types of houses. One is the Hare Paenga, which is the living house for the elites of each clan. But then we also have a larger one called the Hare Nui, which was sort of the communal house, where
Okay.
probably large. So when we talk about those large festivals, that is probably where that would be hosted at, would be at some of these larger Hare Nui. The picture on the bottom, that's actually from Pierre Loti, who's
Mm-hmm.
there in the late 1800s on La Flor. He's the one that basically counts in 1877 there's 110 Rapa Nui people living on the island.
Okay.
Even though they're living on the island, there's still being houses, there's fires, there's chickens around, there's a chief wearing a headdress, and you can see somebody going into a Hare Paenga between the two small statues that are still there.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
you look, you'll see two tiny little Moai Miro, they're called, because they're not
Mm-hmm.
full Moai, some classifications.
It is totally fascinating, though, to think about how stone is just so pervasive in their lives, from their houses to, they're building these terraces. And, this lithic mulching, where you do this to collect rainwater, it's used in many different areas of the world. I first learned about it in the American Southwest. But it's also something that people are thinking about introducing to more arid areas in the face of climate change. So it's an
Yep.
aspect in how anthropology and archaeology can actually try to have some positive impact from learning about these very complex sort of stone technologies, right? To think about, all these crafts and then the different places where these quarries are, but then there's also these mines. Is this
Yes.
from your research as well?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so
Yep.
can you tell us about this? Is this on where are these mines? Are they off of Ranukau over here?
No, these ones are on the south coast there. So
Okay.
southwest coast. Yep.
Aha, right
That's where,
here.
and that's just a product again of a very unique lava flow,
Mm-hmm.
that it was one consistent flow that just kept belching material. But instead of Putoki Toki in the area we just saw where there was multiple layers, here they're focused on
Mm-hmm.
just one layer of a very unique andesite stone that is laminar. We call them keho, and these are perfect for fish hooks or drills, small tokis or adzes. So they basically were mining because they like that stone to have these tabular chunks for whatever they were doing. But they also had other areas. So underneath there, you'll see something called kiea, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the mineral pigment for painting. So again, we saw
Aha.
Ho'ohakanaia. So here they're maximizing their workforce by having them in one unique area, And then in the corner there was another place called for poro, which are the beach stones, and those are the hammer stones. In one little area here, you have tabular, you have kiea, you have poro. So that means I got paint, I have hammer stones, I have raw materials, all in one little section.
And if this
And
is
it's
where the drills are coming from, this is the drills that are creating the post holes and the softer basalts that we see in the houses.
there's a better place for that,
Aha.
particularly. Yeah, there's one. I mean, you're on to. I love you're good like that. You're paying attention. There's one other area on Poike, which is mapped here. It says Poike source. That is one of the hardest materials, but they
Okay.
actually had to climb down to uh to get that source. It's a very difficult source to get at. So we
Okay.
imagine that they had belay systems tied off in baskets, and they probably lowered those baskets down to canoes on the ocean or dragged back up to where there's actually a platform monitoring that particular source.
Hmm.
So we see a variety of ways stone, sometimes it's communal, sometimes it's opportunistic, sometimes they're exchanging between confederations, and then the good old sometimes the elite is just controlling a source.
Yeah.
And there's so Rapa Nui, we can see a variety of socio-political mechanisms that were used, but it's still the stone bringing them together, because not one clan had all the stones it needed in its land. In short, they had to collaborate. And
Yeah.
that's the big push about Rapa Nui.
I think that makes sense. And then just to drive home to anybody who's still listening, hopefully somebody is.
Right?
But just the amount of archaeology and the amount of discovery that's happened. This is around the crater of Rano Cow, and
Yes,
it's
sir.
just so many different sites, so many different rock art sites as well, where many of
Yep.
these petroglyphs are coming from. There's just such a critical mass of information that we have that it can be put together in such detail to understand these questions about sort of anything from symbolism to the obsidian sources, which I totally
Yep.
forgot about. Yeah, from obsidian. So this is coming from this volcano, Ranokau, I guess.
Yep. Yep.
And
Exactly. That was a huge. At one time, I want you to think about that. That island looks. That's a collapsed caldera. Think
mhm.
about that being a typical volcano going up for another 200-300 kilometers, right? It would have been huge. And then as it collapsed, but those three sources, because the vent that it's on was perfectly cooled. And that, when I ask the kids, what does the sound that lava makes when it hits water? And they all go, and I say, that's how obsidian gets formed.
Mhm.
So in that way, you actually, if you look down to the bottom where the White Walker's at, the fourth source there is actually out in one of the motus,
Mhm.
and that one could only be accessed by elite members. And that stone we only find in elite contexts like at the Ahu or end burials, because again, elite are controlling some resources, and that makes them stand out. But at the same time, there's still an even flow of communal use that people can get access to all the stone that they would need. So again, to hit that point home, stone brings them together.
Yeah. What comes together is that this was very much an advanced civilization in the sense, and they had advanced stone tool technology.
What happens in Rapa Nui is quite unique in Polynesia. Just I've made this point in my thesis and other places that Rapa Nui was probably the most geologically diverse island in Polynesia, because of its very unique formation and the 100 volcanic events that happen. It creates a diversity of stone. And
Hmm.
these Rapa Nui folks were the geologists of their time. They understand a lot about how the island was formed. I'm not guess I don't think that they were able to date in a way that we can, using radiometric techniques or absolute dating, but they were very keen about hardness, density, fracturing, cleaving. They tested these things as scientists, I bet, and they went through and found which was going to be the best to help them on their journey. So just to tail back with the idea that Rapa Nui, the only thing that Rapa Nui has in common with those other places, they work with stone.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Right? That's the commonality. And just because they work with stone doesn't mean you need some type of diffusion or hyper diffusionism. We've been working with stone for 2.6 million years. It's not a new thing.
I mean,
right?
yeah, exactly. Humans have been working with stone nonstop.
Non,
Like
non,
nonstop. We still are
nonstop,
today. And
nonstop.
knowing where to go to get so many different varieties of volcanic stone that appears. And so, yeah, I think it's amazing to put all this together in this way, to see the site in a different way, in color, with all this different technology that brings it together. And I think that that's really important. And I think it's sort of, I can't really thank you enough for all your experience and to bring this here and share it. You spent so many years on this island doing different sets of research and helping out with the locals and befriending them and getting to know them. And so thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And just one last
Thank
note
you.
to everybody else: you need this expertise to be able to put together archaeology in your mind's eye. You have to be familiar with all these details. You have to understand that these Moai are looking inwards towards the people and not out. As we can see, Easter Island, Rapa Nui, it's very fortunate for having so many different kinds of stone. That's how we can put together sort of the social structure of what's going on. So explain this last slide. I've been I've been staring at it, and what does it mean?
So this actually, to be honest, this was from the University of Auckland for my master's, where your dad was one of my profs, and I was really into GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and my advisor there, Dr. Thane Lagafuggin, who had just started a program on Rapa Nui with Dr. Chris Stevenson out of Virginia Commonwealth University. We started to use different analytical techniques, and one of them that we started to think about was viewshed analysis. Was
Mhm.
from one point in a landscape, what's seen and unseen. So you use a digital elevation model, and you can cast one point and then look out into the landscape and see what's intervisible between sites. So I started to get interested then in, okay, what can be seen and not seen from a platform?
Mhm.
And usually, I think on the higher end, it's like 85% of the time, a productive resource is always within the visibility of a platform. And
Interesting.
I argue that there's a reason for that. It's because the elites of the past are maintaining that fertility. They're making sure that that chicken house that's out there, the Harimoa, or the garden, the Manavai, that's producing those tubers and bananas, the oven that's actually cooking those resources, that you're going to be under the fertility of those ancestors of the past. But it's also a mechanism of control. We know on Rapa Nui, the elite live closest to the platform, and the non-elite live farther out into the productive fields. So you can imagine if you wanted to wake up and take something from your patch that wasn't allocated or granted, the ancestors are watching you. So I've made an argument that these ancestors are sort of the first CCTV cameras. They're maintaining a social order of this Rapa Nui trajectory. And it's by keeping this order with the eyes in. So it's interesting. Mata is the word for eyes, but mata is also the word for clan. So
Mhm.
perhaps the mata is everything the ancestors can see. So that's why we have this sort of visibility analysis called viewshed. And over on most platforms, more than 80% of the time, a resource is always under the eyes of the living and dead ancestors. And I believe it's the panoptic. It's for a control aspect.
Interesting.
And that, so that was the just of bringing political economy into some of the discussions and moving forward. But from my end to end, I just will also want to thank you, your dad. I also wanted to thank all of my colleagues that have helped me on this trail. They've put up with me for 25 years on the island. My name is Tanata Ma'a, which means the crazy man, because I constantly am working and doing things and being active. I thank the contemporary Rapa Nui people, but I also thank those that have passed. You know, the island in 1877 have 110 people living on the island. And it's because of them today that we have a good base of the oral tradition and knowledge that is so valuable that we can intertwine with all the different fields of study that we have. So let's just not forget that Rapa Nui is a human elaboration made by Polynesian colonizers, probably between 1100 current era to 15 current era. They probably had 500 to 600 years of uninterrupted use, that they were their own domain. And they created that culture with little diffusion. They didn't need an amazing civilization to teach them anything, because they have this heart of Polynesia they come from. They come to the most diverse geological island that's out there. They became scientists of their land, geologists and marine biologists and botanists, and they were able, through their own means, to create these 25,000 archaeological features and more than 1,000 moai and 100 pukao and 300 platforms. This is not because of some advanced group through hyperdiffusion. This is a great example of independent innovation based on the ancestors. And that's exactly what Rapa Nui is about.
Perfect. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.